what if the Emperor died on Molech? The screaming starts 3 seconds before the warp gate collapses. Not the screaming of men or daemons, but something older, something that has no throat to tear or lungs to empty. It's the sound the universe makes when a pillar holding reality in place suddenly vanishes, and I heard it the moment the Emperor's soul was ripped from his body on the blasted plains of Molech. I was there, you understand, not in flesh, but in the half-space between the materium and the immaterium, where navigators dwell when they guide ships through the Imperium's howling currents. My third eye saw what no mortal gaze should witness. The precise instant when humanity's greatest weapon, its most terrible hope, died before his grand design could be completed. The Emperor had gone into that warp gate alone, descended into the realm of the ruinous powers to bargain or steal or murder his way to the power he needed for the Primarch project. The official records would later claim he emerged victorious, that he wrested from the dark gods the very essence required to create his 20 gene-forged sons. But in this timeline, in this cursed iteration of events, something went catastrophically wrong in those howling depths. Perhaps Tinch's schemes ran deeper than even he anticipated. Perhaps Khorne's fury found a gap in his psychic defenses at the crucial moment. Perhaps all 4 Chaos gods, for one eternal instant, ceased their infinite bickering and struck as one unified abomination. The specifics matter less than the result. The Emperor died screaming in the warp, and his death scream tore holes in the veil between dimensions that would never properly heal. I felt it in my bones, in my third eye, in the genetic architecture that makes my kind what we are. Every navigator in the Imperium, from the youngest child just manifesting the mutation to the most ancient patriarch hoarded in noble house vaults, felt that psychic shockwave were attuned to the warp in ways baseline humans can never comprehend, and the Emperor's death was like having the sun suddenly extinguished while you're staring directly at it. Hundreds of navigators died instantly, their third eyes literally exploding from their foreheads as the feedback loop of that cosmic death scream overwhelmed their psychically sensitive tissue. I survived, though I've never been certain whether that constitutes mercy or the cruelest punishment imaginable. The scar tissue around my third eye still weeps clear fluid when I concentrate too hard on warp space, and sometimes, in my dreams, I still hear that scream echoing through dimensions that have no name in any human language. The Mechanicum knew within hours. Their sensor arrays on Molech detected impossible readings, gravitic distortions and chronometric anomalies that suggested something had gone fundamentally wrong with local space-time. The tech priests initially theorized a contained warp core breach, or perhaps experimental weaponry misfiring during the compliance operations. They dispatched servitors and junior magi to investigate, their thinking still bound by conventional warfare parameters. Those first investigation teams found the Emperor's body 3 kilometers from the warp gate's original coordinates, though body is perhaps too generous a term for what remained. The golden armor was intact, unmarred by any weapon or claw, but the flesh within had been hollowed out, scooped clean by forces that operated on principles beyond conventional physics. The skull was empty, not broken but evacuated, as though his mind and soul had been vacuum extracted by something hungry and infinitely patient. Malcador the Sigillite received the confirmation through his network of astropathic relays, though even those messages arrived corrupted, fragments of coherence buried in screaming static. The old man had been the Emperor's longest companion, his most trusted advisor, the only living human who truly understood the scope and ambition of the Great Crusade. I never met Malcador personally, but the fragmentary records suggest he aged 20 years in the span of reading that first astropathic transmission. His hands trembled as he decoded the message, and witnesses reported that he wept, actual tears running down those ancient cheeks. The only time anyone had seen such an expression from that stone-faced counselor, he knew immediately what this meant, understood with perfect clarity that every plan, every carefully balanced scheme, every psychological lever the Emperor had installed across his nascent Imperium, all of it was now balanced on a knife's edge over an abyss of complete civilizational collapse. The Primarchs learned at different speeds, their reactions filtered through the unique psychological architecture the Emperor had engineered into each of them. Horus, commanding the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet in the Olana sector, received word through official Mechanicum channels, and immediately ordered his fleet to make best speed for Terra. He still believed in chain of command, still trusted that the Imperium's infrastructure would hold. Horus was, in many ways, the most balanced of the Emperor's sons, the one designed to serve as war master when the Great Crusade's primary phase concluded. His response was rational, measured, exactly what a loyal general should do when receiving news of his commander's death. That rationality would prove his undoing in the weeks ahead. Leman Russ learned differently. The Wolf King was prosecuting compliance actions in the Fenris subsector when the astropaths aboard his flagship began screaming and clawing at their own faces. Russ, understanding that psychers don't simply lose their minds without cause, immediately ordered his ships to drop from warp translation and conducted a thorough investigation. His rune priests, those space wolves who wielded psychic abilities but refused to call it sorcery, confirmed what the Navigator houses were only beginning to whisper. The Astronomican, that great psychic beacon the Emperor maintained from Terra to guide ships through the warp, was flickering. Not gone, not yet, but diminished, weakened, like a lighthouse lantern burning down to its final dregs of oil. Russ's response was characteristic. He howled, a sound that echoed through every deck of his flagship, and ordered his entire fleet to make immediate translation to Terra, regardless of warp conditions or navigational hazards. He lost 3 ships to warp predators during that reckless journey, but the Wolf King had never been one to carefully calculate acceptable losses when rage drove him forward. Robert Guilliman received the news through proper channels, verified it through redundant sources, and immediately began implementing contingency protocols. The Lord of Ultramar had always been the Emperor's logistician, the son who understood supply lines and administrative architecture with the same intuitive genius that Horus understood battlefield tactics. Guilliman's first action wasn't to rush to Terra or to weep or to rage. He convened his command staff and began analyzing worst-case scenarios, running calculations on how long the Imperium could maintain cohesion without the Emperor's psychic influence and administrative oversight. His conclusions were not encouraging. The Imperium, Guilliman realized with cold clarity, was not yet a self-sustaining system. It was still essentially a cult of personality built around the Emperor's superhuman capabilities and psychic dominance. Remove that central pillar, and the entire structure began to exhibit predictable failure cascades across multiple interdependent systems. Angron learned last, because by the time the official notification reached him, he'd already descended into the neural pain fugues that his butcher's nails inflicted upon him between combat operations. The World Eater's Primarch was, even then, the Emperor's most tragic creation, a son so damaged by external modification that his original psychological programming could barely function beneath the artificial aggression engines hammered into his skull. When Angron finally processed the information, his response was laughter, bitter and ragged, the sound of someone who's always suspected that cosmic justice is simply a lie the powerful tell the weak. He'd never loved the Emperor, had never forgiven the humiliation of his surrender, and now the being who'd enslaved him was dead. Angron didn't rush to Terra. He continued his compliance operations with renewed viciousness, and if his World Eaters noticed their Primarchs smiling during the slaughter, they attributed it to the usual symptoms of the Nail's influence. The political fracturing began within the first month. The Imperium in those days was a patchwork of recently conquered worlds, newly compliant civilizations, and grudging tributary states, all held together primarily by fear of the Emperor's retribution and hope for his protection against the galaxy's infinite horrors. With the Emperor dead, that binding force evaporated like morning frost under a harsh sun. Planetary governors who'd bent the knee to the Golden Giant suddenly recalculated their odds of independence. Rogue trader dynasties began carving out private kingdoms in sectors where imperial authority had always been thin. The Mechanicum, that strange priest civilization orbiting Mars, immediately began internal debates about whether their alliance with Terra was binding absent the Emperor's personal leadership. The Adeptus Custodes, those golden-armored guardians who'd served as the Emperor's personal bodyguards and executioners, found themselves in an impossible position. Their sacred duty was to protect a man who no longer existed, and their programming had never accounted for this specific scenario. The Astronomican's failure was gradual but irreversible. The Emperor had maintained that great psychic beacon through constant effort, feeding it with his immense psychic power the way a man might breathe to stay alive. Without him, the machinery designed to amplify and project that beacon quickly began to malfunction. The tech priests, responsible for its operation, attempted desperately to compensate, but they were trying to maintain a system designed around a power source that had no equivalent in the material universe. Within 6 weeks, the Astronomican's effective range had diminished by 40%. Within 3 months, it was barely visible beyond the segmentum solar. The Imperium, already vast and unwieldy, suddenly found itself functionally divided into isolated pockets of territory where local warp conditions allowed limited navigation, separated by expanding voids where no navigator could safely guide a ship. I watched it happen from the observation deck of a Navigator house fortress monastery in the Colchis belt, tracking the degradation with instruments that measured psychic phenomena the way normal sensors measure electromagnetic radiation. The Astronomican's light, once a brilliant constant that every navigator used as the reference point for all warp navigation, became unstable, prone to sudden fluctuations and unexplained absences. Ships attempting long-distance warp jumps began disappearing at unprecedented rates. Some emerged centuries later, their crews mummified or mad or transformed into something that wore human flesh like an ill-fitting costume. Others simply never arrived at all, lost in the warp's churning chaos, presumably torn apart by the predators that infest those impossible spaces between stars. The Imperium's great engine of conquest and expansion ground to a halt, not because of any enemy action, but because the fundamental infrastructure enabling interstellar travel had suddenly become lethally unreliable. Malcador attempted to hold the political center through sheer force of institutional inertia and personal authority. He declared himself Lord Regent, claiming the Emperor's mandate to govern until such time as a proper succession could be established. The problem, immediately apparent to anyone with basic political instinct, was that the Emperor had never established a succession protocol. He'd intended to live forever, or at least so long that succession planning was irrelevant on any human timescale. Malcador's authority derived entirely from his personal relationship with the Emperor, and with the Emperor dead, that authority became a thing of perception and belief, rather than objective reality. Some factions within the Imperium accepted his claim. Others, particularly those with military force to back their ambitions, did not. The Primarchs complicated everything. They were genetically engineered demigods, each designed for specific strategic roles in the Emperor's grand plan, and now that plan's architect was gone. Some, like Guilliman and Dawn, believed in the idea of the Imperium as an institution worth preserving regardless of the Emperor's death. Others, like Angron and Curzay, had never believed in anything beyond personal loyalty to their gene-father, and with him dead, their motivation to participate in imperial governance evaporated. The middle positions were most dangerous. Primarchs like Horus and Lorgar, who believed in the Imperium's mission but had their own ideas about how it should be structured, who should lead it, what philosophical principles should guide it. The First Civil War erupted 11 months after Molech. Not the grand, orchestrated Horus Heresy that would have occurred in the original timeline, but something smaller, nastier, more personal. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, ever resentful of perceived slights and insufficient recognition, declared independence for the fortress worlds his legion had conquered and fortified. When the Adeptus Administratum dispatched diplomatic missions to negotiate his return to compliance, he had every diplomat executed and their heads launched in ballistic capsules toward Terra. Perturabo's declaration included a comprehensive denunciation of the Imperium's fundamental structure, a coldly logical explanation of why the Emperor's administrative model was inefficient and required complete architectural revision. He was not wrong in his analysis, which somehow made his betrayal more infuriating to those who still believed in Malcador's regency. Dawn of the Imperial Fists responded with characteristic directness, mobilizing his legion for immediate punitive action against Perturabo's breakaway faction. The resulting conflict consumed both legions for years, a grinding siege warfare nightmare that saw entire star systems reduced to lifeless rubble. Neither Primarch could claim decisive victory. Perturabo's genius for fortification made his positions nearly impregnable, while Dawn's stubborn refusal to accept anything less than total surrender made negotiation impossible. The war between the Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists became a bleeding ulcer on the Imperium's flank, draining resources and attention from the larger strategic situation, even as more critical crises erupted elsewhere. Lorgar presented a different problem. The Primarch of the Word-Bearers had always been the Emperor's most devoted son, the one who'd worshipped him as divine even when the Emperor explicitly forbade such veneration. The Emperor's death on Molech sent Lorgar into a theological spiral that his legion followed with frightening enthusiasm. If the Emperor had been divine, how could he die? If he was merely mortal, what justified the Imperium's conquest of the galaxy? Lorgar's search for answers led him, inevitably and disastrously, into the warp's deepest mysteries. The Word-Bearers discovered chaos, not as an enemy to be fought but as a truth to be embraced, a fundamental reality the Emperor had hidden from his sons and from humanity itself. Lorgar's conversion to chaos worship was gradual, rational, supported by evidence and philosophical argument in ways that made it uniquely dangerous to counter. The Word-Bearers' transformation from loyal legion to chaos cult occurred over several years, carefully hidden from external observation. Lorgar was patient, scholarly in his approach, building his theological arguments with the same methodical care he'd once applied to crafting the Lectitio Divinitatus. By the time the Imperium's intelligence services realized what was happening, entire chapters of the Word-Bearers had already undergone the rituals of chaos dedication. Lorgar's sermons, once focused on the Emperor's divinity, now preached of gods far older and more honest in their cruelty, powers that offered tangible blessings rather than terror's distant promises of protection. The Legion's ranks swelled with cultists and daemon-possessed marines, and Lorgar declared that the true Great Crusade would be one of spiritual liberation, freeing humanity from the Emperor's lies about the warp's fundamental nature. Horus watched all this from his position leading the Imperium's largest remaining fleet concentration, and something in him broke quietly, without drama or announcement. He'd been designed to be War Master, engineered to coordinate the Emperor's conquests once the Primarchs had fully matured into their strategic roles. But the Emperor's death had come too soon, before Horus had fully grown into that intended position, and now he found himself commanding forces in a strategic environment that no longer matched his programming. The doubt started small, a question here, a second guess there, but it metastasized under pressure. Was he obligated to follow Malcador's orders? Did the Imperium's mission still matter without the Emperor to define it? Could he do better, make decisions the Emperor would approve of, or was he simply delaying inevitable collapse through force of will and personal charisma? The Xenos took notice. Of course. You don't simply lose the galaxy's most powerful psychic beacon without every predator civilization marking the event. The Orcs, those fungal nightmares that thrive on conflict and seem to materialize wherever humans gather in sufficient numbers, launched warg after warg into suddenly vulnerable Imperial space. Without the Emperor's strategic coordination and the reliable warp travel his Astronomican enabled, Imperial forces couldn't mass quickly enough to counter these incursions. Entire subsectors fell to green tides of savage violence. Human populations reduced to corpse piles and entertainment for Orc war bosses. The Eldari craft worlds, those massive arc ships carrying the last remnants of a dying race, grew bolder in their attacks on human settlements, their farseers having apparently calculated that humanity's moment of greatest weakness had arrived right on schedule, with predictions made millennia prior. Most concerning were the Rangdan, though few outside the Mechanicum's highest circles or the Primarch's private councils knew how close that particular threat came to complete extinction of human space. The Rangdan genocides had been barely concluded when the Emperor fell on Molech, a series of campaigns that had cost the Imperium more casualties than nearly all other compliance actions combined. The Emperor's personal involvement had been crucial to humanity's survival during those wars. Without him, without the strategic genius and psychic might he'd brought to bear, a Rangdan resurgence would have been apocalyptic. The fact that no such resurgence occurred in the immediate aftermath of Molech owes more to the Rangdan's own internal divisions than to any Imperial defensive capability. But the threat remained, dormant and patient, waiting in the void spaces between stars where human sensors couldn't reliably track movement. Malcador lasted 3 years before the stress killed him. Not assassination or coup, just the simple accumulated weight of trying to hold a fragmenting Imperium together through personal will alone. His body finally gave out during a session of the Senatorium Imperialis, the governing council he'd created to provide some illusion of democratic process to what was essentially his personal dictatorship. He collapsed mid-sentence, his ancient physiology finally unable to sustain the psychic and physical strain he'd been channeling through it. The tech priests who examined his corpse concluded that his biological age at death exceeded 500 years, that the Emperor had been maintaining his old friend's life through constant psychic intervention, and that without that support, Malcador's mortality had caught up with him all at once. His death removed the last thread of continuity connecting the Imperium to its foundational moment, the last living voice that could claim, with any credibility, to speak for the Emperor's intentions. The succession crisis that followed Malcador's death made the earlier political fracturing look like genteel disagreement. Multiple factions within Terra's government claimed legitimate authority to govern. The Adeptus Custodes, emerging from their grief-induced isolation, declared that only they, as the Emperor's personal guards and executors of his will, could determine proper succession. The Mechanicum insisted that technical expertise and infrastructure management should determine governance, that only those who understood the Imperium's technological foundation could safely steer it. The Administratum, that vast bureaucracy responsible for actually operating the Imperium's day-to-day functions, argued that practical administrative control constituted legitimate authority regardless of theoretical claims. Each faction had compelling arguments. None had the military force to impose their will on the others without triggering total civil war. The Primarchs should have been able to resolve this. They were, after all, the Emperor's sons, his most powerful and capable creations, beings engineered specifically to lead humanity through the galaxy's dangers. But the Primarchs were themselves divided, pulled in different directions by their individual psychological programming and their unique perspectives on the Emperor's mission. Guilliman advocated for a constitutional system, a government of laws and institutions rather than personalities. Dawn supported military governance, arguing that only those who'd actually fought for the Imperium had the right to determine its future. Lorgar preached chaos worship with increasing openness, claiming that the Emperor's death proved that humanity's future lay with the warp gods. Angron simply didn't care, continued his private wars with increasing brutality. A mad dog whose chain had been permanently severed. Horus, the one Primarch who might have had the authority and capability to unite his brothers, remained paralyzed by doubt, unable to commit fully to any faction or philosophy. The Astronomican's failure reached terminal stage 7 years after Molech. The last tech priests maintaining its machinery finally admitted what everyone had known for months. The beacon was dead, its psychic projection mechanisms burned out by years of operation without proper power supply. Terra's light, the guiding star that had allowed the Imperium's explosive expansion, winked out. The immediate effect was catastrophic. Every ship currently in warp translation lost its primary navigational reference. Thousands of vessels, perhaps tens of thousands, simply never emerged from the warp. Those that did arrive at their destinations found themselves in regions of space with no way to safely leave, marooned by the simple fact that long-distance warp travel without the Astronomican was effectively impossible for vessels carrying baseline humans. I felt that final extinguishing in my third eye, a sensation like having part of your soul suddenly amputated without anesthetic. Every navigator in the galaxy felt it simultaneously, that hole where the Astronomican's light had been, and the despair was overwhelming. My house went into mourning rituals that lasted 6 months, and I know we weren't unique in that response. The younger navigators, those who'd never known space travel before the Astronomican, handled it worst. Some went mad, their third eyes unable to process the fundamental shift in warp space's perceptual landscape. Others simply gave up, refused to guide ships anymore, declared that humanity's age of stars had ended and that we should accept our new isolation with grace. The older navigators, those who remembered the age of strife before the Emperor unified Terra and re-established the Astronomican, adapted better, But even they understood what this meant. Humanity was about to rediscover what isolation really feels like. The Imperium fractured along predictable fault lines. Without reliable warp travel, individual star systems and subsectors became self-governing by necessity rather than choice. Some maintained symbolic loyalty to Terra, others declared independence openly, and most simply stopped considering the question relevant to their daily survival. The grand dream of a unified human civilization spanning the galaxy died, not with dramatic battle or philosophical defeat, but through simple logistical impossibility. You cannot govern what you cannot reach, cannot enforce laws when enforcement fleets require decades or centuries to arrive, cannot maintain cultural cohesion when communication between systems becomes as rare as visitation. Terra itself descended into political chaos that made the earlier succession crisis look like orderly debate. The various factions within the Throne World's government abandoned all pretense of cooperation and began actively warring for control of the planet's resources and infrastructure. The Adeptus Custodes fortified the Imperial Palace and declared its sovereign territory under their exclusive jurisdiction. The Mechanicum seized control of Terra's industrial facilities and manufactorums, threatening to cut off weapon and equipment production if their political demands weren't met. The Administratum, lacking military force but controlling the bureaucratic machinery that kept Terra's population fed and sheltered, played factions against each other through careful distribution of resources and permissions. The resulting stalemate produced a Terra divided into functional city-states, each controlling some critical infrastructure component, each unable to destroy the others without triggering their own collapse. The Primarch civil wars escalated into total conflicts that consumed entire sectors. Perturabo and Dawn remained locked in their eternal siege warfare, but now other legions joined, picking sides based on philosophy, practical alliance, or simple opportunity for advancement. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, always sensitive to aesthetic and cultural considerations, declared support for Guilliman's constitutional model, believing that only formal legal structure could preserve the civilization he valued. Mortarion of the Death Guard, bitter and fatalistic, sided with no one, instead leading his legion into the galaxy's most toxic and inhospitable regions as though seeking death through sheer environmental hostility. Alfarius and Omegon of the Alpha Legion simply disappeared, their legion fragmenting into cell structures pursuing agendas so opaque that not even other Primarchs could determine whose side they'd chosen. Lorgar's chaos-corrupted word-bearers grew bolder in their operations, no longer hiding their new theological orientation. They attacked loyalist Imperial forces openly, targeting recruitment worlds and supply depots, seeking to spread chaos worship through the Imperium's collapsing structure. The daemons came through where Lorgar's rituals opened stable gates, not the massive incursions that would characterize later chaos invasions, but targeted insertions of specific daemon entities tasked with sowing corruption and despair. The word-bearers as ships prowled the warp routes, preaching to any vessels they encountered, offering chaos as gifts to ship crews, desperate for any advantage in the increasingly hostile galaxy. Many accepted those offers. The alternative, clinging to loyalty to a dead emperor and a collapsing Imperium, seemed increasingly irrational. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels might have been able to unite the loyalist factions, might have provided the charismatic leadership necessary to counter Chaos's ideological offensive. He was the most beloved of the Primarchs, the one whose beauty and nobility inspired devotion even from his brothers. But Sanguinius suffered from the Red Thirst. That genetic flaw the Emperor had failed to purge from the Blood Angels' gene seed, and the stress of the post-Molech chaos caused that flaw to manifest more severely than ever. The Blood Angels' descent into barely controlled violence made them unreliable allies, too dangerous to deploy in situations requiring restraint or diplomatic consideration. Sanguinius himself spent increasing amounts of time in isolation, fighting the genetic curse that threatened to transform him into the monster he'd always feared, lurking beneath his angelic exterior. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands responded to the chaos by embracing what he did best, total mechanization of warfare, stripping away human weakness through replacement with augmetic enhancement. His legion became more machine than man, their flesh systematically replaced with cybernetic components until the line between Space Marine and Servitor became philosophical rather than obvious. Ferris's philosophy, if it could be called that, was simple. Humanity's weakness was flesh, and flesh's weakness was death. Make humanity immortal through mechanization, and the Imperium's problems would solve themselves through inevitable attrition of all biological competitors. The Iron Hand's crusade of forced mechanization alienated even potential allies, but Ferris didn't care about popularity, only efficiency and ultimate victory. Vulcan of the Salamanders tried a different approach, focusing on humanitarian aid and civilian protection rather than grand strategic maneuvering. His legion became relief workers as much as warriors, deploying to worlds threatened by Xenos invasion or warp incursion, evacuating populations and establishing defensive perimeters while other legions fought over political abstractions. Vulcan's philosophy emphasized that the Imperium's legitimacy came from protecting its citizens, and that any government that failed that basic function deserved to fall regardless of its legal or theoretical authority. The Salamander's approach was noble, even admirable, but ultimately irrelevant to the larger power struggles consuming the Imperium's remnants. You cannot shame warlords into cooperation through moral example. Corax of the Raven Guard pursued guerrilla campaigns against Chaos forces, leading his legion in strikes against word-bearers and other traitor elements wherever they appeared. His approach was practical, focused on measurable results rather than philosophical victory, but it was also reactive, responding to Chaos incursions rather than preventing them. Corax lacked the resources and manpower to mount offensive campaigns, and the intelligence networks necessary to identify targets before they became critical threats had collapsed along with the Imperium's administrative infrastructure. The Raven Guard's war became a desperate holding action, buying time but never gaining ground. The Khan of the White Scars took his legion into the void spaces beyond charted Imperial territory, seeking answers in the galaxy's unknown regions. He'd always been the most independent of the Primarchs, the one least comfortable with centralized authority and bureaucratic control. With the Imperium collapsing, the Khan saw an opportunity to discover whether humanity's future might lie outside the structures the Emperor had tried to impose. His expeditions found wonders and horrors in equal measure. Human civilizations that had evolved in complete isolation from Terra, Xenos empires of staggering power and sophistication, Daemon worlds where the warp had permanently breached reality. The Khan sent reports back to whoever would listen, documenting the galaxy as it existed beyond Imperial prejudice and propaganda, but few bothered to read them. Survival dominated everyone's attention, leaving little room for exploratory curiosity. Magnus of the Thousand Suns faced the most profound crisis of all. He'd always been the most psychically powerful of the Primarchs, the one who most deeply understood the warp's fundamental nature, and the Emperor's death on Molech confirmed Magnus's worst suspicions about the Imperial Truth's foundation. The Emperor had lied, not just to the Imperium's citizens but to his own sons, about the warp's nature, about the Chaos God's existence and power, about the fundamental reality underlying the Materium. Magnus could see the truth now with painful clarity. The Emperor had been playing a game he couldn't win, trying to starve the Chaos Gods through denial, while simultaneously feeding them through the Imperium's endless warfare. The Emperor's death proved that this strategy was always doomed, that you cannot defeat enemies by pretending they don't exist. Magnus's response was to try what the Emperor had failed to accomplish: direct negotiation with the Chaos powers, seeking a stable arrangement that would allow humanity to survive without constant warfare or spiritual submission. The Thousand Suns deployed into the warp itself, establishing beachheads on Daemon worlds, studying chaos in ways that would have horrified the Emperor but which Magnus believed necessary for humanity's continued existence. His research bore fruit in forms that his legion could barely comprehend: sorcerous techniques that allowed controlled demon summoning, psychic defenses that could turn Chaos's power back against itself, knowledge so dangerous that merely learning it transformed the learner into something no longer quite human. Magnus himself changed, his flesh shifting to accommodate the knowledge flowing through him, his single remaining eye seeing realities that would have shattered lesser minds. The first generation born after the Astronomican's extinguishing grew up in an Imperium utterly changed from what the Emperor had envisioned. These children knew Terra only as myth, the Emperor as distant legend, the Great Crusade as grandfathers' stories about a past that no longer seemed relevant to their lives. The isolation forced human civilizations to evolve independently, developing unique cultures and technologies adapted to local conditions without reference to any universal imperial standard. Some worlds maintained something like the imperial system, governance by military force and rigid hierarchy. Others experimented with democratic assemblies, merchant republics, theocratic councils, or stranger political arrangements influenced by local conditions and historical accidents. The Mechanicum fragmented along theological lines, different forge worlds embracing different interpretations of the Omnissiah's nature and humanity's proper relationship with technology. Mars itself split into competing factions, some maintaining orthodox beliefs about the Emperor's divinity as the Omnissiah's avatar, others declaring that the Emperor's death proved he'd never been the true Omnissiah, still others arguing that the Omnissiah had always been a metaphor for the quest toward technological perfection rather than any specific entity. The resulting doctrinal conflicts sometimes erupted into actual warfare, Skitarii legions clashing on Mars's rust-red surface over questions of theological interpretation and technical orthodoxy. The Navigator houses faced their own existential crisis. Without the Astronomican, our traditional role of guiding ships through warp space became infinitely more dangerous and far less reliable. Ships still needed navigators, perhaps more than ever, but the success rate of warp translations plummeted. Experienced navigators developed techniques for short-range warp jumps using local phenomena as reference points, but these methods were crude, inefficient, and prone to catastrophic failure. The houses began hoarding their most talented members, refusing to allow them to take risks in deep warp translation, jealously guarding the genetic lineages that produced strong navigator mutations. The result was a fragmentation of navigator services, each house serving specific client factions in exclusive arrangements. The traditional neutrality of navigator houses sacrificed to survival concerns. The psyker population exploded. The Emperor had maintained rigid control over human psychic development, culling dangerous mutations while cultivating useful ones, channeling psyker development toward patterns that served imperial interests. Without that control, human psychic potential manifested chaotically, children developing powers their parents couldn't understand and couldn't safely manage. Some worlds implemented brutal suppression campaigns, executing anyone manifesting psychic abilities, trying to breed the mutation out of local populations through systematic genocide. Other worlds embraced psychers, building societies where psychic ability determined social status and political power. Most worlds fell somewhere between these extremes, struggling to manage a phenomenon they didn't understand with tools that seemed inadequate to the challenge. Chaos cults proliferated in the darkness between stars. The word-bearers' missionary work, combined with the general despair and hopelessness endemic to isolated human populations, created ideal conditions for chaos worship to spread. The cults offered what the collapsing Imperium could not: tangible miracles, immediate power, hope that might be illusory but felt real enough to desperate people. Khorne's followers found fertile recruiting ground among populations trapped in endless warfare. Nurgle's devotees spread disease that seemed almost merciful compared to alternatives, offering acceptance and belonging to those whom society had rejected. Scientia's cults attracted scholars and bureaucrats, people who'd built their lives around planning and prediction, now discovering that reality was far more mutable than they'd imagined. Slaaneish's worshippers, perhaps inevitably, emerged wherever human populations concentrated in sufficient density to support the specialization and leisure that breeds decadence. The Eldari watched humanity's collapse with mixed feelings. Some Farseers had predicted exactly this outcome, had seen in their visions that humanity's imperial moment would be brief and self-destructive. Others found the collapse unsettling, recognized that a galaxy without human civilization as a major power would be more dangerous for the surviving Eldari populations. The craft worlds maintained their isolation, occasionally intervening when human conflicts threatened to spill over into regions the Eldari considered strategically critical, but mostly observing with the detached concern of beings who'd already watched their own civilization burn and had no desire to repeat that experience vicariously through humanity's fall. The orcs simply got bigger. Without coordinated imperial response, orc wargs could develop over generations, growing to sizes that would have been impossible when the Imperium's military could mass respond forces quickly. Entire regions of space fell under permanent orc occupation, their human populations either exterminated or reduced to cowering remnants, hiding in places too inconvenient for orcs to bother clearing out. The Orc Empire, if something so chaotic could be called an empire, began approaching the scale of humanity's pre-imperial distribution, and some xenologists speculated that in another millennium, the orcs might actually outcompete humanity for galactic dominance. The thought was almost funny. Humanity's great enemy turned out to be simple fungal spores with better reproduction and adaptation rates. Terra itself became almost mythical over the following decades, its actual condition obscured by distance and broken communication. Different factions of the scattered Imperium maintained different beliefs about what was happening on humanity's birthworld. Some insisted that the Emperor would return, that his death had been temporary or illusory, that any moment now he'd emerge from the Imperial Palace and restore order with a word. Others claimed that Terra had fallen to chaos corruption, that demon princes now squatted in the Imperial Palace, wearing the Emperor's corpse like a costume. Still others suggested that Terra had transcended, that whatever remained there was no longer relevant to baseline humanity's concerns. The truth, inasmuch as it could be determined from fragmentary reports, was simultaneously more mundane and more tragic. Terra continued, its competing factions locked in permanent low-intensity conflict, the population surviving in the ruins of former grandeur, no one faction strong enough to impose order, no shared vision capable of uniting the survivors toward any common purpose. The Primarchs' fates varied. Some died in battle, their gene-enhanced bodies finally meeting opponents they couldn't overcome. Ferrus Manus fell to an orc warboss of unusual size and cunning during a campaign to reclaim an Iron Hands recruiting world. The warboss apparently kept Ferrus's head as a trophy, wearing it on a chain around its neck, and the Iron Hands never recovered from the psychological trauma of seeing their father reduced to orc decoration. Some Primarchs simply disappeared, last seen heading into unexplored regions of space on missions they refused to explain. The Khan vanished into the webway, or so the reports suggested, chasing rumors of a passage through that ancient Eldari infrastructure that might lead to something important. Korax was last reported on a Daemon world, leading his remaining Raven Guard in what appeared to be a suicide mission, though whether he died there or achieved something worth the sacrifice remains unknown. Horus endured the longest, maintaining nominal control over the largest remaining loyalist military force for nearly 2 decades after Molech. But the weight of command, the constant decisions without clear guidance, the knowledge that any choice he made might be the wrong one, all of it eroded his sanity gradually and invisibly until he barely resembled the confident general he'd once been. His final fate remains disputed. Some sources claim he achieved apotheosis, ascending to daemonhood in a final desperate gamble for the power to save what remained of the Imperium. Others insist he died peacefully, surrounded by his most trusted officers, finally released from the burden of responsibility. Still others suggest he underwent radical genetic modification, transforming into something new, neither loyal nor traitor, perhaps barely human, pursuing objectives only he understood in regions of space where human categories of morality and sanity no longer applied. Guilliman lasted longest of all the loyalist Primarchs, his constitutional system managing to preserve functional governance across the 500 worlds of Ultramar even as the broader Imperium collapsed into chaos. The realm of Ultramar became a strange hybrid, part military dictatorship, part constitutional republic, governed by laws Guilliman had carefully crafted to survive his eventual absence, but still dependent on his personal authority to resolve disputes when the system's internal contradictions became irreconcilable. Guilliman's great failure, he admitted near the end, was assuming that humanity could be governed by pure rationality, that good laws and efficient administration could substitute for shared belief and common purpose. The Emperor, whatever his other faults, had understood that humans need myths and meaning, not just logistics and law. The Chaos powers didn't win in any meaningful sense. They grew stronger, certainly, feeding on the misery and violence of humanity's collapse. But they also found themselves with fewer organized opponents worth corrupting. The irony wasn't lost on the more self-aware Daemon princes. Chaos had destroyed its most entertaining enemy, reduced humanity from a species mounting credible challenge to the warp god's dominion, to scattered populations barely capable of maintaining technological civilization. The infinite game of corruption and resistance that Chaos craved required worthy opponents, and the post-Molech Imperium increasingly failed to provide those. Some Daemon princes actually attempted to stabilize remaining human civilizations, not from mercy but from recognition that their own existence was more interesting when humanity could mount coordinated resistance to Chaos's influence. The Xenos inherited the galaxy by default rather than conquest. The Necrons, those ancient machine beings slowly awakening from their millions-year sleep, found their territorial expansion almost unopposed by comparison to what they'd expected. The Tau, barely noted as a minor species during the Great Crusade, established their own small empire in regions humans could no longer control. The Tyranids, that horrific extragalactic swarm, would eventually arrive to find not a unified human civilization capable of mounting coordinated defense, but scattered populations offering easy biomass harvesting. The galaxy's future appeared to belong to species that had avoided humanity's particular combination of ambition, capability, and self-destructive tendency. But humanity survived, diminished, divided, no longer capable of mounting the Great Crusade's grandiose civilizational project, but surviving nonetheless. Humans proved adaptable in ways the Emperor might not have anticipated, might not even have approved of. The scattered populations developed their own solutions to local problems, technologies and cultural practices the Mechanicum would have deemed heretical, but which worked for their specific circumstances. Some worlds embraced genetic modification, engineering their populations for local environmental conditions. Others developed psychic techniques that would have horrified the Emperor, but which allowed functional coexistence with chaos rather than futile resistance. Still others achieved technological breakthroughs through combination of human engineering and carefully studied Xenos science, creating hybrid systems that transcended either species' individual capabilities. The Navigator houses adapted by becoming even more secretive, more isolated, guarding our genetic heritage with paranoid intensity. We understood that our ability to guide ships through warp space, even in its degraded and dangerous state, was the only thing preventing complete civilizational isolation. My own house established protocols for genetic preservation that bordered on the disturbing, carefully controlled breeding programs designed to optimize Navigator mutation while eliminating undesirable variations, turning ourselves into something engineered rather than evolved. We became strange even by Navigator standards, our third eyes seeing further into the warp than ever before out of sheer survival necessity, but at cost to our basic humanity. I sometimes wonder if the Emperor would recognize us as still human, or if he'd classify us as something new, perhaps something that should be purged for the Imperium's theoretical purity. The question that haunted survivors, the question that has never been satisfactorily answered, is simple. Could this have been prevented? Was the Emperor's death on Molech truly random, the result of Chaos God intervention that couldn't have been anticipated or countered? Or did the Emperor make a fundamental error, miscalculate the risks he was taking, overestimate his own capabilities in ways that made catastrophic failure inevitable? The tech priests who examined his body, or what remained of it, reported evidence suggesting that he'd been engaged in combat within the warp for what subjectively might have been centuries, that time dilation within the Chaos realms meant his final moments stretched across eternities of struggle. If true, this suggests the Emperor hadn't been ambushed or defeated through sudden overwhelming force, but rather had been ground down through attrition, worn away by enemies patient enough to wait for him to make a single mistake. Lorgar, in his chaos-addled wisdom, claimed to know what had killed the Emperor. According to the word-bearer's Primarch, now more Daemon prince than gene-forged son, The Chaos Gods had learned patience from their interactions with the Eldari's fall. They'd recognized that the Emperor's great weakness was his inability to accept cooperation or genuine alliance, his insistence on controlling and dominating every situation. So they'd simply waited, allowed him to commit fully to his incursion into the warp, then closed the trap with infinite patience, knowing he'd never call for help, never admit he might need assistance, never do anything except fight alone until either he triumphed or he died. The Emperor's pride, that fundamental conviction that he alone understood what humanity needed, had killed him more surely than any demon's claw. The surviving records of Malcador's final months include fragments of conversation suggesting the Sigillite had reached similar conclusions. In private discussions with his most trusted advisors, Malcador apparently admitted that he'd warned the Emperor about Molech, had advised against the solo incursion, had suggested alternative approaches that might have achieved the same results with less risk. The Emperor had dismissed these concerns, had been absolutely certain of his capability to handle whatever the warp threw at him. Malcador's bitterness about this, his rage at the Emperor's hubris costing humanity its best chance at galactic civilization, colored everything he did as Lord Regent. He'd been trying to save the Imperium out of duty, but also, perhaps, trying to prove that the Emperor's approach hadn't been the only way, that cooperation and institutional structure could achieve what individual superhuman capability had failed to accomplish. The cults that emerged worshipping the dead Emperor often missed the central irony of their devotion. They prayed to a being who'd explicitly rejected divinity, who'd built his entire philosophical framework around the imperial truth's materialist skepticism, who'd punished Lorgar for treating him as divine. The Emperor had wanted to be remembered as humanity's greatest general and engineer, not as a god. But humanity needed gods, needed something to believe in that transcended immediate material concerns, and so they transformed the Emperor's memory into exactly what he'd tried to prevent. The ecclesiarchy that eventually formed around Emperor worship would have horrified him, I think. This vast religious infrastructure built on foundations of faith and superstition that contradicted everything the imperial truth had claimed about reality's nature. Yet that ecclesiarchy served functions the imperial truth never could. It provided meaning to suffering, offered hope when material circumstances suggested only despair, created community bonds that transcended rational self-interest. The priests who administered emperor worship were often corrupt, frequently hypocritical, sometimes outright malicious, but they also preserved something of civilization in places where pure rationality would have produced only nihilistic surrender. Perhaps the emperor had been wrong about humanity's needs. Perhaps faith and myth are not obstacles to be overcome, but fundamental aspects of human psychology that any functional civilization must accommodate rather than suppress. The debate over whether the emperor had been human, post-human, or something else entirely consumed scholars for generations after Molech. Some argued he'd been a product of shamanic ritual in humanity's distant past, thousands of ancient psykers combining their essence into a single immortal being. Others claimed he was humanity's next evolutionary step, a natural development of psychic potential given vast time to mature and develop. Still others suggested he might have been an alien or even a chaos-touched entity who'd successfully hidden his true nature through millennia of careful misdirection. The absence of any definitive answer frustrated everyone seeking historical clarity, but perhaps that ambiguity was appropriate. The emperor had always been whatever each person needed him to be, and his death didn't change that fundamental quality. I've spent decades since Molech trying to understand what I saw when the emperor died, passing my memories for details that might explain the unexplainable. My third eye recorded impressions that normal human perception could never capture, the way reality bent around his death, space-time itself recoiling from the absence where his presence had been. The warp screamed not in triumph but in what seemed almost like grief, as though even the Chaos Gods recognized they'd destroyed something unique and irreplaceable. The Emperor had been many things to many people, but in the warp he'd been a fixed point, a presence so powerful that even his enemies could navigate by his light. Without him, the warp became more chaotic, less stable, harder for anyone, even demons, to navigate reliably. The prophecies and visions that followed the Emperor's death suggested something stranger than simple mortality. Psychers across the galaxy reported dreams of a golden figure waiting, gathering strength, preparing for some future return. Lorgar claimed these visions were deliberate deception by the Chaos Gods, intended to sustain false hope in humanity's remnants. Magnus argued they might be genuine, that the Emperor's death in the material realm didn't necessarily mean total extinction, that something of him might have survived in the warp, transformed and patient, waiting for conditions that would allow reconstitution or return. Neither theory could be proven. Both inspired fanatic belief and violent rejection, and the question remained open, generating endless speculation but no definitive answers. The final generations who'd actually met the Emperor, who'd served directly under his command or lived while he walked Terra's streets, carried burdens the younger populations couldn't understand. They'd seen the Imperium at its moment of greatest power and purest vision, had believed in the Great Crusade's promise of rational galactic civilization, and then watched it collapse into fragmented chaos ruled by superstition and violence. Some became bitter, their faith curdled into cynicism, unable to find meaning in the survival that had cost so much. Others achieved a strange peace, accepting that empires rise and fall, that nothing lasts forever, that the Emperor's dream had been beautiful but perhaps always doomed. The wisest among them focused on preserving what could be preserved: knowledge, technology, the capacity for human kindness and cooperation even in the darkest circumstances. The technologies the Emperor had introduced to the Imperium degraded slowly across generations. Without the Mechanicum's unified research programs and quality control, individual Forge worlds developed their own standards and modifications, technical drift, that gradually made equipment from different worlds mutually incompatible. The Space Marine's gene seed became increasingly unstable, mutations accumulating over generations as the quality control measures the Emperor had implemented fell away. Some chapters embraced their mutations, incorporating them into their identity and combat doctrine. Others fought desperately to maintain genetic purity, becoming increasingly isolated and brittle as they purged any variation from original specifications. Both approaches produced functional warriors, but neither maintained the standard the Emperor had intended. The political question of succession never truly resolved. Different factions within the scattered Imperium maintained different claims about legitimate authority, different interpretations of what the Imperium even was after the Emperor's death. Some insisted that any governance claiming imperial authority must derive from Terra, must maintain some connection, however tenuous, to the physical seat of the Emperor's power. Others argued that the Imperium had always been an idea rather than a place, that any civilization maintaining the Emperor's values and vision could legitimately claim imperial status regardless of connection to Terra. Still others declared the Imperium fully dead, insisted that maintaining its corpse served no useful purpose, that humanity needed new political forms adapted to post-Emperor reality rather than futile attempts to resurrect the past. My own house's records, compiled over decades of careful observation and analysis, suggest that the Imperium's collapse was demographically inevitable regardless of the Emperor's death. The logistics of maintaining control over millions of worlds scattered across the galaxy, the communication lags inherent in even the fastest warp travel, the cultural drift as populations evolved under local conditions, all of it pointed toward eventual fragmentation. The Emperor's death simply accelerated a process that would have occurred eventually anyway, compressed what might have been centuries or millennia of gradual decline into a few catastrophic decades. This analysis offers cold comfort. If true, it means the Emperor's grand vision was always impossible, that he'd been trying to hold back historical tides no individual, however powerful, could permanently overcome. Yet the dream didn't fully die. Scattered across the galaxy's vast darkness, human populations still speak of Terra, still teach their children about the Emperor, still maintain hope that unity might someday be re-established. These beliefs might be delusional, might serve only to delay necessary adaptation to permanent isolation, but they also preserve something worth maintaining: the idea that humanity is more than individual worlds or populations, that we share something fundamental that transcends immediate material circumstances. The Imperium as political reality died on Molech along with its Emperor, but the Imperium as dream, as aspiration, as possibility, that survived in fragments and whispers, passed down through generations who'd never seen Terra's golden spires or walked beneath the Emperor's gaze. The final judgment on the Emperor's life and death may take millennia to render. Perhaps he was humanity's savior, who would have lifted us to galactic dominance if chaos hadn't murdered him at the crucial moment. Perhaps he was humanity's tyrant, whose death liberated populations to develop in ways he'd never have permitted. Perhaps he was simply what he appeared to be, an exceptional individual who tried to save humanity through methods that seemed rational at the time but which, in retrospect, contained the seeds of their own failure. The truth probably contains elements of all these perspectives, more complex than any simple judgment can capture, requiring examination from angles that won't exist until future civilizations look back on this period with historical distance we currently lack. What remains certain is that the galaxy changed on Molech in ways that can never be reversed. The Emperor's death transformed human history, redirected it down paths that lead to destinations no one can predict. We live now in the shadow of that event, all of us shaped by choices the Emperor made and by the consequences that flowed from his final failure. Whether that shadow will eventually lift, whether humanity will emerge into some new golden age, or whether we'll simply fade away as the galaxy moves on to other concerns, only time will reveal. For now, we survive in the ruins of the Emperor's dream, making what meaning we can from fragments and memories, hoping that our descendants will judge us kindly for what we managed to preserve from the wreckage. The screaming that began 3 seconds before the warp gate collapsed has never fully ended. If you know how to listen, if you train your senses to perceive the warp's deeper currents, you can still hear it echoing through dimensions that have no name. The universe remembers when a pillar holding reality in place suddenly vanished, and that memory shapes everything that came after. We are all living in the Emperor's death scream, residents of a galaxy forever changed by one being's terrible final moment. That is the legacy of Molech, not triumph or failure, but transformation so profound that we still cannot fully grasp its implications. Consequences that will ripple forward through centuries yet unborn, shaping human destiny in ways the Emperor himself could never have foreseen.